Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Thaïs Croes and I'm hosting today's webinar together with my colleague Brian Flood. After the main presentation, we will pass the baton on to Pierre Simon, who will be your host for the Q&A. In this webinar, we will take a deep dive into the latest round of European sanctions against Russia and explore the various aspects of the package, including the targeted sanctions, import and export bans, and enforcement measures. But first, a short introduction. The sanctions that have been imposed up until now make it difficult for Russia to finance the war in Ukraine and develop new weapons and war machines. The sanctions come in different forms. There are sectoral sanctions that target the financial, the trade, the transport, the technology, and the defense sectors, putting pressure on the Russian economy. There's also individual sanctions, targeting the individuals responsible for the invasion or the facilitation thereof. Sanctions on individuals consist of travel bans and asset freezes. Sanctions on entities consist of only asset freezes. To date, the European Union has adopted 10 sanctions packages against Russia, with each new package adding more individuals and entities to the sanction lists, as well as new import and export bans on different types of products. Some of the key points to note are that not only import and export bans from and to Russia on a variety of products have been implemented, but also a ban on providing different types of services is applicable. Some of these services are accounting, auditing, tax consulting, legal advisory services, brokering services, etc., to entities established in Russia. There's also a SWIFT ban for Russian and Belarusian banks. SWIFT is a messaging service that substantially facilitates information exchange between banks and other financial institutions. SWIFT connects more than 11,000 entities worldwide. As a result, these banks can neither get foreign currency nor transfer assets abroad. This has negative consequences for the Russian and Belarusian economies. However, there may be a way that the Russian banks can circumvent this SWIFT ban altogether. I will dive further into these circumventions later. There's also a very restricted access to the European primary and secondary capital markets for certain Russian banks and companies, which yet again impacts the Russian and Belarusian economies in a negative way. After this short introduction, let's move on to the next part of the webinar, the 10th sanction package.
Hello and welcome. We will now take an in-depth look at the 10th package of Russian sanctions recently enforced by the European Commission. Given the severity and scope of the 10th package of Russian sanctions, it is important to understand the implication and potential impact of these measures. First, let's start with the targeted sanctions. In total, 87 people and 34 entities have been targeted by sanctions. These include key decision makers, such as members of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation, Russian deputy ministers, and government officials. In addition, people and entities operating in the Russian military and defense sector, such as military leaders and companies manufacturing weapons for the Russian armed forces, have also been sanctioned. But the sanctions go beyond just those involved in the military. People alleged to be responsible for the deportation and forced adoption of Ukrainian children have also been hit with sanctions, as well as proxy authorities such as prosecutors in non-government controlled areas of the Ukraine. Writers, presenters, media executives, and organizations that are said to be spreading disinformation and propaganda have also been targeted. Furthermore, the sanctions have been extended to Iranian nationals who are alleged to be involved in the supply of drones to Russia for use in the Ukraine, and economic actors in sectors providing a substantial source of revenue or financially supporting the Russian government, such as Alfa Bank, Rosbank, Tinkoff Bank, the National Wealth Fund of the Russian Federation, and the Russian National Reinsurance Company have also been hit with sanctions. Those designated are subject to an asset freeze, which means EU citizens and companies are forbidden from making funds available to them. Natural persons are also subject to travel bans, preventing them from entering or transiting through EU territories. From a financial point of view, Alpha Bank has been hit with restrictions on access to the capital market, as well as having its assets frozen. Tinkoff Bank, the National Wealth Fund of the Russian Federation, and the Russian National Reinsurance Group have strictly just had their assets frozen as a result of being sanctioned. These targeted sanctions are an important tool in the international community's response to the crisis in the Ukraine, and they demonstrate a commitment to holding those responsible for human rights abuses and destabilizing actions accountable. We will now take a look at the enforcement and anti-circumvention measures implemented by the EU. The new packages include strict reporting obligations on Russian central bank assets, which is especially significant for the possible use of public Russian assets to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. In addition, there are reporting obligations on frozen assets, including for dealings before listings and assets that should be frozen. The EU has also banned non-scheduled private flights between the EU and Russia, directly or via third countries, and prohibited the transit of dual-use goods and firearms via the territory of Russia to third countries. To ensure that these measures are fully enforced and to prevent circumvention, David O'Sullivan, the EU sanctions envoy, has reached out to third countries to emphasise the importance of these measures. The European Commission has proposed strengthening the reporting obligations on frozen assets linked to the sanctioned companies and individuals, and suggested fines of up to €50,000 for individuals and up to 10% of annual turnover of entities. Moreover, natural and legal persons, entities, and bodies must report the assets and reserves that they hold, control, or are counterparties to at the Central Bank of Russia. These new reporting requirements will apply as of the 27th of April 2023. These measures are necessary to ensure the effectiveness of the sanctions package and to prevent circumvention. By imposing strict reporting obligations, the EU is ensuring that sanctioned individuals and entities cannot easily circumvent the sanctions by hiding or moving their assets. This will increase the pressure on Russia to comply with international law and respect Ukraine's sovereignty. The next area of interest is the targeting of import and export bans. The EU has introduced new measures to strengthen control over import and export operations, particularly regarding the Russian military and industrial complex. The main aim is to implement export bans on critical technology and industrial goods that contribute to Russia's military capabilities. New export restrictions have been introduced on sensitive dual-use and advanced technologies, with any transit of dual-use goods being prohibited. The list of goods subject to export bans include electric generators, binoculars, radars, compasses, construction goods like bridges and structures for tower-like buildings, forklift trucks, and cranes. Goods critical for the functioning and enhancement of Russian industrial capacity, such as electronics, machine parts, pumps, machinery for working metals, have also been hit with export bans. The EU has prohibited the transit through Russia of these exported dual-use goods and technologies. On the one hand, the EU has prohibited the import of European goods and goods that can be easily redirected to support the Russian war efforts. such as trucks and other heavy vehicles, construction machines, pumps, and other machines used in the construction sector. Additionally, electronic components used in Russian weapon systems, including drones, missiles, helicopters, and other vehicles, have also been put on the list of sanctioned goods. Moreover, 96 additional entities associated with Russia's military industrial complex have been added to the EU sanctions list. The value of export bans is €11.4 billion, while the value of import bans is €1.3 billion. These imports and export bans are a critical measure to restrict the flow of goods and technologies that contribute to Russia's military capabilities. Enforcement and anti-circumvention measures have been implemented, including new reporting obligations on Russian central bank assets and frozen assets. We've also seen updates to legal acts, including more detailed reporting obligations and new reporting obligations for operators to the Member States and the Commission. It's a bit tedious to mention all these acts one by one, but feel free to make a screenshot. I'll move out the way for a couple of seconds. So this concludes our analysis of the 10th package. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat area and we will address them in the Q&A section later on. I'll now turn the floor over to Thaïs, who will discuss the various ways Russia could try to circumvent these sanctions.
Thank you, Brian. We started this webinar with a short recap of different forms of sanctions that have been imposed, including sectoral sanctions, individual sanctions, and asset freezes for entities. This was followed by a dive deeper in the EU's adoption of the 10th sanction package against Russia. In this final part of the webinar, we will discuss several methods of circumventing sanctions. Let's start by exploring the alternative solution that Russian banks have implemented to bypass the SWIFT ban, and how they are finding alternative sources of financing in response to restricted access to the EU's primary and secondary capital markets. As mentioned earlier, the SWIFT ban has created negative consequences for the Russian and Belarusian economies. However, Russian banks have found a way to circumvent this ban by setting up their own payment systems. By doing so, they can conduct transactions and transfer assets abroad without relying on SWIFT. Some Russian banks have already established their own payment systems, and the use of these systems have increased since the implementation of the SWIFT ban. Moreover, Russian banks have also started to rely on the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, SPFS, the Russian equivalent of the SWIFT financial transfer system developed by the Central Bank of Russia. The issuance of the Mir bank cards, Russia's alternative to Visa and MasterCards, has also increased. These alternative payment solutions have allowed Russian banks to conduct transactions and transfer assets abroad without being dependent on SWIFT. Moving on to alternative sources of financing. Russian banks are looking beyond the EU to countries such as China and the Middle East. These countries offer alternative financing options that are not restricted by the EU sanctions. Furthermore, Russian banks can turn to the Russian government for financial support through a special fund established to assist companies impacted by the sanctions. This fund provides financial assistance to companies that are struggling due to the sanctions, thus providing a lifeline to the Russian economy. To summarize, the Russian banks have implemented alternative payment solutions to bypass the SWIFT ban and are looking beyond the EU for alternative sources of financing. These solutions have allowed them to continue conducting transactions and transferring assets abroad, despite the restrictions imposed by the EU. The Russian government has also provided financial support through a special fund, which has helped mitigate the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. The next circumvention methods have been used by countries like Iran and North Korea and could potentially be used by Russia. One of the methods of circumventing sanctions is illicit trade. This involves using middlemen or front companies to sell goods and services to sanctioned countries, or buying goods from them without disclosing the origin or the destination of the goods. Smuggling is another method that involves physically transporting goods across borders illegally without going through formal channels. This method could be facilitated by corrupt officials or smugglers. Another method of circumventing sanctions is by using cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies are digital currencies that can be transferred anonymously without going through traditional financial systems. This allows countries to move funds around without being detected. Barter trade is another technique that countries can use to bypass sanctions. This involves trading goods and services without using currency, which allows countries to circumvent sanctions by avoiding the use of traditional financial systems. Creating shell companies is another technique that countries can use to hide their true financial activities. This involves setting up companies that have no real operations but are used to facilitate illicit financial transactions or to hide the true owners of the assets. Finally, cyber-enabled financial crime. This involves using hacking or other cyber attacks to steal funds or to conduct fraudulent financial transactions. This method can be used to circumvent sanctions by stealing funds from sanctioned countries or conducting financial transactions without being detected. This brings us to the last method, the U-turn. This method was used by Iran before reaching a nuclear deal with the United States in 2015. The U-turn is a loophole in the US sanction regulations that allows transactions involving sanctioned countries to be processed through US banks if they are denominated in US dollars and involve non-sanctioned parties. However, in 2018, the US Treasury Department revoked the U-turn authorization for Iran, citing Iran's continued support for terrorism and development of ballistic missiles. So how does the U-turn work? If a sanctioned party in Europe wants to sell goods to a party in Iran that is subject to sanctions, they could use a US bank to process the transaction as long as it's denominated in US dollars and does not involve any US parties. This transaction would be processed through the US bank, but the funds would be immediately transferred out of the US banking system to complete the transactions. This allowed Iran to bypass the US sanctions and access funds that would have been otherwise frozen. Although the U-turn is no longer a viable method for circumventing sanctions on Iran, could it be an option for Russia? Thank you all for taking the time to join us for this webinar. We hope you found it informative and insightful. We will now move on to the Q&A session with our expert host, Pierre Simon. Don't hesitate to ask any questions you may have. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you in the Q&A.
Well, welcome everyone to the Q&A section of today's webinar. We, of course, appreciate your participation and engagement, and we are very much looking forward to answering any questions you might have. Let's look at the first set of questions. And I think as Thaïs just mentioned in regards to the U-turn, so the U-turn, although it's no longer a viable method of circumventing sanctions on Iran, could it be an option for Russia or its citizens in evading the EU sanctions against them? Well, while the U-turn method may have been effective in the past for circumventing sanctions on Iran, currently it's not a viable option for Russia or its citizens to evade EU sanctions. The EU, however, has implemented strict measures to prevent any attempts to bypass their sanctions, and any such sanctions would be met with severe consequences. Please note here that it is important for all countries and individuals to abide by international sanctions and work towards finding any peaceful solutions to conflicts. So to give a short answer to this question, the U-turn has eventually been used only for the circumvention of Iran sanctions. And it doesn't seem to be a viable option for the Russian-related sanctions. But we haven't seen any of those cases yet. So there might still be some ways for Russian or sanctioned persons to do so. Let's look at the second question. So what kind of documentation and record-keeping requirements are necessary to demonstrate compliance with the EU-Russia sanctions? Well, to demonstrate compliance with the EU-Russia sanctions, it is of course necessary to maintain comprehensive documentation and record-keeping. This includes keeping records of all transactions and communications related to the sanctioned entities, as well as any due diligence measures taken to ensure compliance. Additionally, it is important to maintain up-to-date information on the current sanction list, review and update these legal consequences. Let's look at the third question. Just now, Thaïs mentioned barter trade as a circumvention method. So what are some of the most common goods and services that are traded through barter arrangements to circumvent sanctions? And what are the most effective ways to detect and prevent these activities? Before I dive into this question, maybe it's good to look at what barter trades actually are. So as you might know, maybe I will dive immediately into the question. So some of the most common goods and services that are traded through barter arrangements and sanctions include oil, precious metals, but also agricultural products, luxury goods. And the most effective ways to detect and prevent these activities include monitoring financial transactions, enforcing trade embargoes, and increasing international cooperation and information sharing among law enforcement agencies. Additionally, implementing strict penalties for those who engage in illegal barter trade can serve as a deterrent and help to prevent these activities from occurring in the first place. So let's have a look at the next question. And the next question is in relation to the sanction list in the EU. So what are the main sanction list, or what is the main sanction list in the EU? Well, currently the main sanction list in the EU is what we call the consolidated list. So every sanction regime, and we have over 40 in the European Union, they have their own, well, most of them have their own lists containing individuals and entities. And there is also a consolidated list, which is maintained by the European Union. And that is being updated the moment that, of course, new people are added to that list or entities. And in practice, how it works, of course, is that there are some commercial databases that are using this information to actually gather them together and offer them through API links or any other solutions to oblige entities or any other entities that need to comply with the sanction legislation. And this, coming back indeed to the consolidated list, this is a public list that can be accessed through internet. There's also an option which they offer is that you can subscribe to this one to get notification the moment that there is an update to this list. Another way to look at the sanctioned individuals is what we call the EU sanction map. That contains an overview of all the sanction regimes, referring also to the legal acts, but also to the persons, individuals, and entities for each of those sanction regimes that are put on the sanction list. A small disclaimer there is that it's not always 100% accurate. There might be a little bit of a delay in updating that list. So the most accurate list would be the consolidated sanction list. Now looking at the next question. Are there any new risks or challenges that compliance officers should be aware of in light of these sanctions? Yes, definitely. So compliance officers should be aware of any potential risks and challenges that may arise due to these sanctions. These may include increased scrutiny from regulatory bodies, changes in trade and business practices, but also potential legal and financial consequences for non-compliance. Note here that it is important for compliance officers and any other compliance professionals to stay up to date on the latest developments and regulations related to these sanctions in order to effectively manage and mitigate these risks. Let's have a quick look before I go into the other questions, if any new questions popped up into the chat. No, I would like to ask you, please also use the chat if there are any other additional questions. Then, of course, we can answer those. All right, let's look at the next question that came. How can financial institutions affect and prevent the use of cryptocurrencies to circumvent sanctions, given their anonymity and lack of regulation? I think this is an interesting question. So, as we know, financial institutions have been regulated, I think, looking at AML and sanctions-related laws and regulations since, well, years already. But there are ways, of course, in using cryptocurrencies to circumvent this. It needs to be noted here that there's not a lot of things that financial institutions themselves can do to monitor and prevent the use of cryptocurrencies, since they are not offering it themselves. So this is more, of course, on the cryptocurrency providers to have the right mitigating measures and controls in place. But what is also an option, of course, is understanding cryptocurrency, the way it works, and also looking into any exchanges or clients, customers that might be involved with cryptocurrency transactions. This can be seen in the description. So, for instance, if there is a deposit or a payment being made to a crypto exchange, for instance, or there are incoming payments from an exchange, then that can be, of course, an indicator that cryptocurrencies are involved. But, of course, also in the description itself. Another thing would be is really understanding how it works, as I mentioned, and also to understand the new developments, blockchain analytics. There are a lot of tools being used. So there are a lot of tools out there which can definitely be used whenever the next step needs to be made. Of course, a bank or any other financial institution cannot see, based on the transactions itself, from transaction monitoring, what the next steps are, where the money came from in relation to cryptocurrencies. But of course, by utilizing those blockchain analytic tools, that is a way to track the movement of cryptocurrencies and identify any potential suspicious activity. Let's look at the next question. So why is the reporting obligation on Russian central bank assets significant for the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war? I think this is a valid question. So the way the European Commission at least envisioned this in the European Union is that the reporting obligation on the Russian central bank assets, that it is significant for the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. Reason for this is that it can help identify and recover assets that were illegally taken from Ukraine during the conflict. So that's also the main reason that a lot of emphasis has been put on reporting any potential Russian central bank assets that might be in the reach of your own organization, to report this, specifically, as I mentioned, to help trace those assets and use those assets to rebuild Ukraine after the war. Next question, how often is a new sanction package released? So as you know, currently we already have the 10th package, which we're talking about today. There are some notices and some talks about an 11th package. So just going back, the first package started actually in February. So within just a couple of months of last year. So within over a year, we had 10 packages. So the frequency of these new sanction packages being released varies depending on the specific situation and the governing body responsible for implementing them. Some sanctions may be released on a regular basis, such as annually or quarterly, while others may be released as needed in response to specific events or violations. So normally, whenever there is like a new sanctions legislation, there will be a term, let's say once in every 6 months or once in every year, that it will be updated, that it will look at the validity and expiry date of that specific sanction regime. In regards to the packages, of course, it's a combination not only of updating one specific regime or piece of legislation, but multiple, as if we've seen as well in these many sanction packages. They touch upon the Russian sectoral sanctions, the Belarus sanctions, the Ukraine territorial integrity sanctions, and many more. So it has a huge impact. And currently we cannot We don't know yet if and when the new package will go out, but it all depends on developments. I do expect at least an 11th and potentially a 12th package, but we have to wait and see and follow the developments. Then moving into the next question, is there an available list or database with all the sanctioned entities and individuals? Well, this question links a little bit to the question I answered before in regards to the EU sanction list. So there are several lists and databases available that contain information on sanctioned entities and individuals. These lists are typically maintained by, in our case, looking at our topic, by the EU. And as I mentioned, this is the consolidated list. On top of it is also the list on the EU sanction map that is also kept up to date, although there might be a small delay in regards to the information there. Those are the public lists. On top of those lists, there are also commercial sanction databases that are being used. Some examples of these sanction databases are, for instance, we have WorldCheck, Bureau van Dijk Orbis, Open Sanctions, LexisNexis, and many more of those databases out there. Some of them are paid databases, others are free. And these are really useful if you would like to do a quick check. If you do not have a link directly to your customer base, you want to do a manual check, then these are easy ways to do it. And it also shows, and I think that's the benefit of these lists, that is not limited only to the EU sanction lists, but also to US OFAC related lists, the UK and other jurisdictions. So it gives a comprehensive view. And also a lot of these databases are even more advanced, that they also offer information about PEPs and other high-risk areas. So it's not only limited to sanctions. So let me have a quick final look if no other messages came in. I've got a question here, an additional question from Luca. Can we please also cover restrictions on export of dual-use items? Yeah, I think this is a good one. So in regards to dual use, there is, of course, a separate pieces of legislation on the items maintained on considered dual use for military purposes or any other. So from an export perspective, I know the European Commission is working hard on updating their Q&As. So I would definitely recommend to keep an eye on those specific Q&As, which not only focuses on, of course, on the traditional entities, individuals that are put on the sanction list, but also on the export controls, specifically related to the dual-use goods. The dual-use regulations has also been recently been updated. So my tip here would be to have a look at the publications from the European Commission, the Q&As. I know that especially now with all these packages, that also they focus a lot to update their Q&As and also specifically on exports of dual-use items. Okay, I don't see any additional questions coming in. If there are no additional questions, I would like to thank you very much for joining us today. Together with me, my whole team hope that you found the webinar informative and valuable. If you have any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And remember, you can also access additional information, as I mentioned, on the sites of the European Commission and any other relevant websites. But also on our website, we do have information also on different topics, including sanctions. Again, we appreciate your time and participation, and we look forward to connecting with you soon again. So on behalf of the whole team, goodbye and have a great day.